might be surprised not hearing Kendra's name tonight. She is vacationing on some beach somewhere, and we're all very upset and jealous about that. But we'll go to confession and we'll get over it. Meanwhile, you have to listen to me and my good friend, Kim Wells Estrada. I shouldn't say you have to listen to us. You are privileged because Kim is going to share her conversion story. She is a radical disciple. She loves Jesus with her whole heart, and it wasn't always that way. She's also an incredible therapist who works with the mentally ill and the very poor and downtrodden. And I mean, we'll have you back on the show, Kim, because you have amazing stories of how Jesus works through you to help the most disenfranchised in the world or in our country. So, Kim, I'm going to give you the floor and just start from the beginning. What were you like before you found God?
First of all, I want to say hello to everyone. I grew up, I'll start just from the very beginning. So I grew up in a small town in New England, and an only child to my parents. And, I am the product of an oops pregnancy. My mom knew my dad for 3 months, got pregnant, and didn't really know my dad. And it was a little controversial, like whether mom should keep Kim or if, mom should not keep Kim. And so mom decided to keep me. And, very quickly she learned that my dad was a pretty violent alcoholic. So, growing up for me involved a lot of violence, a lot of really scary times. There was all forms of abuse in my home. The intensity and the duration was super difficult. I mean, it's hard to, it's been a long time, but what I remember the most as a little girl is being afraid for my mother's life and being afraid for my life. So there was a lot of hiding out. There was a lot of running. There was a lot of running to family, only to have dad kind of chase us down. And, God, I was introduced to God. I remember that. And I remember, more than that, I remember always having this sort of connection with, I understood it was God, but I didn't really understand the character of God or really any of the intricacies of who I know God to be today, right? I knew that there was a God. I knew that there was, I had some kind of something protecting me, while at the same time, for a little kid, it didn't make sense that all this bad stuff was happening. Yet I knew something was there. And so
how did you know there was a God? What gave you that knowledge?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Catholic family. I hesitated to say that because we went to mass very rarely. I did receive First Communion, and we went for holidays and for special events, but we weren't regular church going people. My grandmother, my entire family is French Canadian. I'm firstborn American on my mom's side. So all of my family really lives in Quebec, Canada. And my grandparents were very devout Catholics, and so they were probably the strongest introduction or the strongest example of it. And my grandmother, we would go to my grandmother's for periods of escape, so I would spend a couple of weeks during the summer, and that was the place that I always felt loved. I always felt safe. I did go to church with them. And I felt like I got the love that I didn't get at home, and I felt like I knew I was going to be okay there. And, as time went on, they never got easier, put it that way. We just got better at escaping the violence. And when I was 11 years old, I was on one of those trips visiting my grandma. And, I hadn't heard from my mom in a couple weeks, and I was really scared. I kept trying to call, couldn't get through. And later I learned that my house had burned down, and my dad was trying to like, I guess, fix the furnace or something, and with somebody else, not a professional, and the furnace exploded,
Oh.
and there were no lives lost. Everything was destroyed,
Oh.
and except for when we went back and we were kind of like going through, like, what the remains. There was this, a resin statue of Mary, was about maybe 2 inches tall. Like, it was buried underneath some dirt and just like in this kind of blanket that was somehow like survived. And I remember finding it amongst, like, there was piles and piles of rubble, right? Like, of just remains. And I was like, wow, Mom, look at this. Like, that was, so I started to have more of an interest in Mary. And I remember at my paternal grandma's house, again, Catholic, kind of in name only over there, a lot of violence in that home too. There was a statue of Mary, and it was a miraculous medal, like that, the image of her and the miraculous medal. And so I remember just having this affinity for Mary, not really knowing. I knew she was a mother of God, but didn't know a whole lot about her. I knew about the importance of purity. Again, I can't tell you where I learned that. After my house burned down, we moved.
And how old were you when your house burned down?
I was 11.
You were 11.
And so, in one way, I was really excited just to be able. Excited is probably too strong of a word, but I looked forward to kind of leaving that behind. That was a really dark, hard period for me and my mom. And I started going to a Catholic school, and I absolutely loved going to a Catholic school. I loved my religion class. I get teared up. That's when I started to learn about who God was, and, my story has a lot to do with living, with people living their faith. The nuns that I encountered, I hear all kinds of stories about people's, parochial education. I was really blessed that my story involves really loving nuns that somehow knew what was happening in my life without me ever telling them, without my family ever telling them. They knew. And they loved me with the love of Christ. And that was a huge piece for me. It was a huge turning point where kind of recognizing and acknowledging that there were other people that could love me, and that God equated to this kind of love, right? And this kind of passion in me to learn, and the excitement that I got from that. I was always a good student and excelled there for the most part. And so I really enjoyed that, however, there was this other piece of me too that was starting to happen, that because of the sexual abuse I experienced, there was some over-sexualized behaviors. That's what we'd call them in the professional realm. And I wasn't having sex, but I was like kind of surprised at how I was behaving while I was it was very interesting when I look back. I always felt guilty and ashamed. I don't know why I was, like, at that time I didn't know why I was even doing it. Other than like to feel accepted or to feel popular or whatever. And so, and that's where I also started to learn. I think I spent more time with friends. I started to learn that there was something really wrong with my life, that it wasn't normal to kind of to be woken up at 2 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table and just, tortured verbally, and that was also about the time that, my dad, he was really, he was particularly nasty verbally, and just a lot of evil words would come out of his mouth. And I remember that was the time, I had always felt like, again, I had kind of alluded to not feeling loved, not feeling like I was safe at home, getting that in doses from my grandma and grandpa and from the nuns that I had met. But I always had this sinking feeling of like, I'm not wanted. I don't belong here. I'm not like, and kind of looking at what was going on in terms of how I was being treated. That's what kids do, later in my professional life, learning that, I made sense of the world by thinking, it must be my fault. It must have been something I did. Well, my dad, at that time it was one of his drunken tirades. He told me that I was supposed to be an abortion and that I was never supposed to be born. And told me and started listing all the family members that didn't want me alive. And, that was probably one of the darkest times for me. I can remember it like it was yesterday. And I just, it just solidified everything that I had been through, right? It solidified all the fears that I had, all the, oh my gosh, it just was like, you know what, you really aren't wanted and you really aren't supposed to be here. And look, he told you, like he just, so, I started to get really angry and I started to get resentful. So my hurt, that it oftentimes hurt masks, anger, fear. Well, I became really angry. And about 14 years of age is when I discovered alcohol. I had my first drink of alcohol. I consumed 3/4 a bottle of Bacardi on my first drink. Needless to say, I got very drunk. And I remember feeling like I was accepted. I felt like I was a part of. And I also remember sitting crisscross on the side of a major interstate freeway, vomiting all over myself, and cars were just flying past me, going super fast, flying past me, and feeling like all of a sudden, like the good that I felt for a very short amount of time, all of a sudden was not good at all. And I got in trouble, and from there off, I just was off and running. I drank more. I drank every week. I drank several times a week. I started using drugs. And my aspirations, like there's still that part of, kids who grow up in these environments, they grow up in addiction or alcoholism. If I'm better, somehow you're going to love me. Even without the next drugs or alcohol present, is the thinking that I can do something to make things better. Right. And so all of those aspirations to get better, to keep getting good grades, they kind of went away. And
and it went away because you thought, what's the point?
Yeah, I thought, I had tried so hard. I had done everything. And look, like there wasn't, I had just kind of given up in a way. And I think it was my way of survival, right? Like the pain was so significant. Like I remember flashes of like memories before the age of 11. I remember the fire and I remember flashes, but I don't remember a huge chunk of my history, and that's what happens. I've experienced severe trauma from the beginning, from in the womb. And so I drank, I got arrested several times. My grades started falling. I became somebody that I never thought I would become. And then the sexual promiscuity started. I was one of the last ones out of my friends. I had made this promise to Mary when I was in middle school that I would remain a virgin and I would stay pure. And, and I didn't. And I was never someone that when I had any kind of sexual interactions, I was almost always under the influence. And I always felt so much guilt and so much disgust. And some of it was probably related to the abuse I experienced, but I know so much of it was my soul was just really understanding that that wasn't the right thing. Like that's not what I was supposed to be doing. Even at the time, I couldn't necessarily articulate why. I just knew that the Blessed Mother was taking care of me and was there. But what I couldn't reconcile was how come things weren't changing? Like, why weren't things different? Like, if you love me and you're there for me and you're watching over me and you're protecting me, it's a very simplistic way, to think, and a very simplistic view of God at the time. And that's the best I could do. And there weren't people explaining to me, right? There were people that were living in good examples. And so that kept me hooked, right? That kept, at least I didn't never shut the door completely, because I knew like God is God, right? And just planted these people, these seeds, these people along the way who just were his love for however long. And so I went to college. I again, was trying to chase that dream, but my grades were so bad, I didn't go to any of the colleges that my family thought I would go to. And I quickly bombed out. I was drinking heavily. It was my first introduction to a psychiatrist, because I was having full-blown panic and anxiety. I had gone 3,000 miles away to Arizona, and I thought it was going to be all better, right? Like I thought, I'm just going to leave this environment because it's, it's Dad, and it's all that insanity and all that terrible stuff he did to me. And
what's happening with your mom throughout this whole thing?
My mom, I remember my mom just being terrified in the beginning, being just utterly terrified. And he was so, his abuse was so intense. And, she could barely speak English when she came to the States and when she met him. And so I would have to speak for her because he just destroyed her self-esteem, any kind of self-confidence. I know, I'm glad you asked that, because when I was about, after my house had burned down, my mom started going to a local church, and there was some nuns that were teaching English. So she worked in a factory, taped her fingers every day. That woman was so hardworking, going through everything she went through the night before. Right. And it was about 5 days a week. We went through some pretty severe physical and emotional abuse and very little sleep. It's funny, you look at my grade school pictures, and in all my pictures, I have these huge dark circles. And so it was just, it's like, wow. But anyway, my mom learned how to speak English. My mom then applied for a different job, and she started making more money, but she started to distance herself. And as I became, I was drinking and using, my behavior was not okay. I thought it was justified for a long time, but I became my mouth was just as bad as his mouth. I could say some horrible, horrible things to cut to the quick, to hurt you so quickly. I was becoming him. And at the time I didn't know, he was the biggest enemy. There's no way I'll never become him. And in fact, I was becoming him. And she was withdrawing and withdrawing and withdrawing. And so, I bombed out of school. I came back with my tail between my legs. I moved back in my house. I tried a bunch of different jobs. I had pieces of success, but all the jobs that I had tried were somehow a part of trying to get me back to college, trying to get me back to school. And towards the end, I kind of where I hit my bottom when I tell my story about recovery, is I was a hairdresser. I was cutting hair, and I was my salon was in the building with 4 recruiting offices of the armed services. And so I was dating a Marine downstairs, and the Coast Guard recruiting office was across the hall from the salon that I was working in. And so there was a recruiter that he'd come in, he'd get his hair cut a lot. And, I really wasn't paying attention, but he was recruiting me. And, at the time I had a serious boyfriend that I absolutely couldn't have any healthy kind of relationship with. I got pregnant, and that was the first time that I ever stopped drinking. So I got pregnant, and I knew that I couldn't drink. And I knew that, I knew that it was a life. There was no way anybody could tell me any different. I knew from the very beginning how I started, the feelings, the changes in the body. And I remember, in at the same time, I had no real perception of how, I knew I was messed up. I knew I had issues. I knew all of that, but never to the extent that I did. But when I kind of came out and told my mom, this was, she just looked at me, and I'll never forget it. And she just said, "Oh, Kim, there's no way you can have this baby." She's like, "You cannot make the same mistake that I made." And I'm my mother's only child. So in that moment, again, here's the second confirmation, right? She was the savior one in my family, right? She's the one who protected me and kept me safe and from everything that he would do, she protected and shielded me a lot. And yet here she is telling me, I was 21 years of age, and it was painful. It was hard. And so there was the second, nail in the coffin, just deep woundedness. And so and at the same time, I was really sick. I ended up having the abortion. I was, everybody around me was giving me money and telling me I need to do this. There wasn't one person that said anything. There were some protesters on the front steps when I went to the clinic. I didn't want to go. Every part of me didn't want to go. And I literally just had their voices in my head. And I'm not trying to blame anybody. It was my decision at the end of the day. But I knew even then, I just knew. I knew that I knew that I knew, right? That it was, you couldn't tell me it wasn't a baby. I've never bought into that. And so I had the abortion, and I remember my girlfriend took me out, and I went, and I'm like, I need to drink. She's like, you just had it. Are you kidding me? I'm like, no, I need to drink. Like I was in so much, like as if I wasn't in enough emotional, turmoil and utter unbelievable pain. Like to add that to it, the depletion it was incomprehensible. It was just, that had just like completely leveled me. And so I ended up getting pregnant again from the same guy, Planned Parenthood and all of their, not positive experience.
What was bad about that?
It was just the, they push so much of like the birth control and abortion as the option, right? And then when I got pregnant again, the way that I was judged and the way that they treated me, I was kind of like, in my head, I was like, if I would have just kept my baby to begin with, I wouldn't even be in this position, right? And again, still my fault. I got pregnant, right? Well, I ended up miscarrying that child. Thank God I didn't have to go through another abortion. But I decided to join the military. I was like, I'm going to try to leave again. I'm going to do another geographic. I'm going to try. Really, I was in the 12-step program, is a famous saying that says I was as desperate as the dying could be. I was as desperate as the dying could be. And I needed to find something to save me. So I joined the military and, and I made it through boot camp. My family was taking bets on whether I would make it or not. And they were sending me letters telling me what the bet was and what the wager was. Yeah. So I was, needless to say, I wasn't in the best shape physically and psychologically. But guess what happened when I was in boot camp? I became like the religious person in my company, and I was like reading scripture and I was going to mass every week, and God, and I was at peace. It was hard, it was difficult. I'm not going to say that, but there was a purity about what I was doing. Right, I wasn't drinking. I couldn't drink. I was praying every night. I was praying to those around me. I was one of the oldest girls at that point, I think it was 23. So, I want to just back up for a second. My grandma died, who was like my mom. She died when I was right around the time I had the abortion. Oh. And, it was like a shock. It wasn't something. She came and she saw me. I was really sick at the time. Like later I would come to learn, like decades later, that I have Crohn's disease. That was really my first major flare, and nobody knew what was wrong with me. I was hospitalized. I was very sick. I couldn't walk. And right before she died, she sat at the foot of my bed, and she just rubbed my feet, and she's like, "You're going to be okay. You're going to be okay." And that was the last interaction I had with her. And then she died of a massive heart attack like a week later. And so I need to bring her up because she was a huge part of why I came to know God, in the way that I did, her example of who she was. And maybe it took many years later for me to really kind of go, oh, I get it now. Left a huge mark on my heart. Right.
So what was she like?
She was, so at her funeral, this kind of sums it up. She was, my family produces maple syrup. So she was the grandma that loved sweets, and we would walk out into, there's lots of land, and we would walk out and she would say, she'd bake us pies and we'd go pick our fruit fresh. And so mine was raspberry. So you'd go pick your raspberries and she'd make you your pie, and she would stitch me clothes and make me blankets. And sometimes I really get speechless of how wonderful it was. I mean, she had a huge garden. We would go pick like our vegetables, and she would sleep with me at night when I had scary dreams. And there was a crucifix right outside my bedroom up there. And there was a picture of Pope John Paul. And it makes me tear up because I just knew by looking at his photo, and, there weren't a lot of words. There wasn't a lot of explanation about faith. It was a lot of doing and a lot of living, so, and, I know Saint Pope John Paul has had, a lot of people have a lot of great love for him, and I do as well. Um, so anyway, so when I went to her funeral, I was in the receiving line, and there was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people there. And I remember standing and just being, person after person came up to me and was like, oh my gosh, I knew your grandmother. And, one time we had no place to live and she took us in. And then the next family would say, oh, we didn't have any money, and my little girl didn't have any shoes for school. And next thing I know, your grandmother had to come by the house and brought me some shoes. I mean, it went on and on and on. It was just, I mean, how better to be remembered, right? Like at your funeral, people talking about like how you were Jesus in their life over and over and over and over again. So, God, it was amazing. It was profound, and I mourned, and that was another part of my bottom. It was, that's the only real attachment, loving, secure attachment that I had in my life. And she was gone.
And I want to take a pause here. You're listening to Find Something More, Find Your Way Home on Radio Maria. And this is Christine. Normally, I have my partner Kendra here with me, and we're fortunate today to have my friend Kim Wells Estrada, and she's sharing her conversion story. And in this episode, we're going to find out the first part of her life, and then next week, hopefully, we'll hear the second. But she went through a lot of trauma. She just shared, especially having an abusive, very, very abusive alcoholic father. And she journeyed into alcoholism, had an abortion, and now she's joined the military, and her dear grandmother, who was the source of love and faith and goodness in her life, has just died. So thank you, Kim. Continue.
So, in boot camp, I'm happy to say that by the grace of God, I was able to graduate, to everybody's surprise, and that was the beginning of the turning point for me. And so I reported to my first duty station, and I very quickly began to drink like the men that I was working with, and kind of got engaged in some of the same sexual behavior. But what was really starting to change was I wasn't getting any relief. Like I wasn't getting that, it's not a authentic relief, right? It's just a masking. It's just to let me feel better for however long. Well, it was going away. And what I was doing when I was under the influence was it was soul killing, right? It was just compounding to the pain and the self-hatred and the disgust I felt for myself. I mean, it was piling it on and on and on. And something I did many, many times when I was drunk is I would talk to God. I would just talk to God. Sometimes I would journal to him, and I would just tell him, how upset I was. And I would just cry out, like, why are you allowing my life to look like this? Why has all this happened to me? There was a lot of whys, right? There was a lot of whys as a little girl, and that's understandable. There was a lot of whys in adulthood, then I wasn't willing to look at my part. Later I was. But anyway, so there was a lot of talking to God, yelling at God, screaming at God, being very upset with him. And, if you loved me, wouldn't, just very interesting. There was always that dynamic, especially later in my drinking. And so I ended up getting a DUI, and it was very early in my military career, and I was looking at a discharge. And that was really, I guess, the other piece of my story that I should share is I was pretty suicidal throughout my life. A very normal thought for me was to not be on earth. I never had any attempts, but the level of suicidality, now that I'm a mental health professional, is alarming. How suicidal I felt for how long. I would fantasize ways to do it. And then I shifted and became more homicidal as I was older and planned ways how I could kill my father because I was so angry and I just wanted him gone. But anyway, this was the first time, when I was facing a discharge. So for me, if you think about it, like that was one of my best successes in a long time, if ever, at that point in my 23 years of life. And now I was looking at potentially being discharged. And what was I going to do? Like I was a drunken disaster. a mess and filled with self-hatred and self-loathing. And I was the most suicidal I had ever been. And so I was walking to work the next day, and, all of a sudden it was like, do you remember like the Snoopy plane went for the MetLife, and Snoopy would fly and he was the pilot, and then there was a banner on the back, like it would trail. Yeah. And so, the banner said, Kim, I will give you the life that you've always wanted, but it will be a life without drugs and alcohol. And I was like, and I knew who it was from. And it wasn't an audible voice, right? But it was so clear and so powerful and so like, whoa. And it just so happened that I was working with someone who was sober. And I ended up meeting with him. And then I got, the Coast Guard found out. And, purely this is where, by the grace of God, I went to my first AA meeting. I was 24 years old. I was the youngest by far in the rooms of AA. And I was in a very small town in North Carolina, and somebody told my story. Somebody drank like I drank, and there were some good Catholics in that meeting, in those meetings to come, who told me very clearly that in order for me to stay sober and in order for me to have a life worth living, or a life that I wanted in sobriety, that I would have to find God, and I would have to hold on to God, and in such a powerful way. And I got to tell you, like, the Lord lit a fire inside of my belly, that lasted for years. I mean, I was on fire. Like, it was like, okay, I got to God everything. And so,
is it because you accepted that challenge and you said, yes, that's the only
absolutely,
way?
Because I said yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Like that. I was sober for 30 days, and the Coast Guard found out that I had gotten a DUI, and again, by God's grace, the commander of my unit told me, he had a sister who was an alcoholic, and he said, you're young, but I see something in you, and you're going to go to the first inpatient unit we can find for you. We're going to fly you there, and then and I'm going to follow you closely. I'm going to make sure that this is a disease of relapse. And if you happen to relapse, know that that doesn't mean the end of your career. That I'm here for you. Wow. And the XO's here for you. And I literally had the top 3 men in that command who, for the first time in my life, by the way, never treated me disrespectfully. It was the first example of like godly, and one of them was a very godly man. And they were there for me, and they supported me. And, I was able to go to an inpatient treatment center. I was sober, and I just started to draw closer and closer to God. I started to dive into his word. I met other Christians on the base. I didn't return to the church right away. I was part of it was like a non-denominational church on base. I started teaching Sunday school, going to Bible study like twice a week. I did a lot of sharing my story. And God just started to heal me. My very first sponsor loved Jesus. And then I gave my life to Christ at like 9 months sober. And I just kept reaching for him. Like, I knew he had the solution. Like, I knew that I was on the right track, but I was still a hot mess, right? Like, just because I stopped drinking and I stopped using, I still had a ton of the emotional pain and suffering. The good part is I wasn't adding any new suffering, right, from new bad behavior. So I'm there for like 18 months, and I'm just doing the best I could do. I have a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety, a lot of really difficult stuff that, again, a lot of prayer, although just really starting to get to know God. And I get transferred to Hawaii, and I am like literally ripped from the womb, because that had been like the only safe space that I had known, right? And but little did I know what God had in store for me. Wow, what he had in store for me was amazing. And so I go 6,000 miles away, and I moved to Hawaii. And I remember I remember being at a meeting. So like kind of like what my thing was, I moved a lot in the military, was I found a church and I found, 12-step group. And I also ended up being in some kind of counseling. That was, I had also started therapy at my first duty station, and that was instrumental. It is not what healed me. It is, I need to be super clear, is Jesus is who healed me. Like there is no doubt in my mind. But can he use mental health professionals? Absolutely. I've had God show up in so many sessions. But, they taught me, and that very first therapist I had was a male therapist, and that was probably the healthiest. The first example of like a healthy male relationship was therapeutic and professional, but it was healthy. I got to process a lot of my sexuality, a lot of what was coming up for me, because now I wasn't anesthetizing anymore. I wasn't numbing. So now I was starting to feel, I was starting to remember, and my memories were visceral, right? I didn't get pictures. So my body had body memories. So when I went
explain for the listeners, and this may be the last thing we have to explore, and we will have Kim return next week on this show, Find Something More, Find Your Way Home on Radio Maria. But Kim, could you share what that was like to have body memories come up? Explain to people, if they're experiencing that, what that's like and what they should do.
So let me, so body memories are, you kind of feel like you're reliving events, and, or, something you could be in a situation. A lot of people report it when they're being intimate with someone or being close to someone or in some way are being reminded, right? And it doesn't have to be an overt act. It could be like a sensation. It could be a smell. It could be being touched a certain way. And you can be launched into having these memories, and they're visceral memories, right? Like there aren't pictures. And so for me, that was
although some people can have pictures.
Oh, absolutely.
Up, right? Yeah, but absolutely. In your case, you didn't. It was more your body just started reacting.
Yeah. So
in what kind of way?
Mm-hmm. So basically, my therapist, we talked a lot. I wanted desperately to have like visual. I wanted to remember. I wanted to have visual memories, and so and he was a very good psychologist, and he said, Kim, we're going to focus on your symptoms, and we're going to focus on these memories your body is having, right? And so and that's what we did, and so when I went to Hawaii, I quickly I want to be able to tell this story in its fullness, so maybe I'll wait for this till next time. But I guess what I can say is that at this far, like embarking on a journey 6,000 miles away, totally terrified and afraid. Like I clung to Jesus. I went to mass. At that time, I went to mass for a while daily. When I worked in Honolulu, I would walk to the cathedral there, and I would go to mass daily. And I would spend many a time in front of the tabernacle. I always knew the real presence. I always knew that was Jesus in the Eucharist. I never had a doubt, I think intellectually I kind of was like, I can't really figure it out, but intuitively, like viscerally, like my body, I knew that was Jesus. And I spent many a time like sleeping in front of the tabernacle at time on certain bases where they had open chapels. And just running to him when I was in so much panic, running to people, in prayer groups. I was always part of a prayer group. Had a lot of people pray over me, lay hands on me. I was going through some heavy duty stuff. And so in Hawaii, I met someone in an AA meeting who she was wearing a crucifix, because I was trying to find these are kind of my people, but I need to find my real people, right? I need to find my tribe, as my husband would call them. And so I remember going to her after the meeting and just talking to her and just kind of checking in with her. And before I knew it, she's like, you know what? I think you need to come to this monastery that I go to with me. And so I'm like, I don't really know you, but okay. And I'd never been to a monastery. So I agree. And this is, on Oahu, the northern part of Oahu. And so we're in the car and we're driving up this winding road. And I am having these overwhelming feelings that I am going to my grandmother's house in Canada. The way the air hit my face, some of the trees. And and I'm not saying anything because I think I'm like losing my mind, but it is like waves on top. I mean, just like, so we go some and we drive some more, and I'm like, wow, this is strange. This is strange. So then we pull up to the main building of the monastery. And on the front steps of the monastery, there's all these potted plants, like along the edges, exactly how my grandmother's front porch looked like the same kind of plant, some of them. And it's, that's Quebec, Canada, and Hawaii. Like, how could that be? And then this monastic nun comes out, and she's waiting for us on the porch, waiting to greet us. And and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what my grandma would do. Like, she'd see us pull out, and she would just stand there. She wouldn't walk to the car. She'd stand on the porch, and she'd wait for you. And here, Sister Mary Jo is her name, was waiting for us. And it was a Friday night, and it was Medjugorje night, because they had all been to Medjugorje, and they all they loved the Blessed Mother. So the name of the monastery, in fact, is Mary, Spouse of the Holy Spirit. And so we went in and we prayed. It was Medjugorje night, so you pray the rosary. And I had never, I don't think, prayed a full rosary. And we prayed all 15 at the time, decades, mysteries. And so we prayed, and during the prayer, I was, again, like, it just was like, wow, I feel like I'm in Canada. Like, this is so strange. So I go to the bathroom, and I go in the bathroom, and you know how water is very unique to certain places? Well, the water was like hard. And then this was the kicker. They had Irish Springs. Remember Irish Springs soap? I don't know if you ever knew it. It's this green soap, exactly what my grandmother had. The exact kind of soap. The water felt the same. I mean, it was just odd. Like, it was, at this point, it was not odd. It was just starting to really freak me out. And so I remember going back, and I was sitting next to Sister Mary Jo, and I said, you know what, Sister Mary Jo, I really feel like I'm in Canada. And she just looked at me and said, I feel like I'm at my grandmother's house. She's like, oh, baby. She's all like, oh, honey, don't worry. She's like, it's okay. It's okay. And so then we go to, the prayer time is done. And then we go and we sit around the table, and all the monks are sitting around the table, and they break out like nacho chips, like tortilla chips and salsa, which, again, I know this sounds silly, but is exactly what my grandma used to do at the end of the night.
Oh my gosh. So Kim, this is so beautiful. And I love that it's not going to end.
No.
So Radio Maria listeners, you have just heard Kim's journey from a little abused girl who believed in God. She was given the gift of faith even through incredible trauma. And I invite you to listen to this show if you've tuned in the middle of it, to go to queenofpeacemedia.com, click on the Radio Maria shows, or go to youtube.com and type in Queen of Peace Media, and you'll find these shows. Kim, I'm so enthralled, and I wish the show were 2 hours and we could find out what happens next. But you can tell that God is up to something.
Yes.
That God and her grandma are clearly
it's super
up to
exciting.
something.
Super life-changing.
And, I'd like to close with a prayer of hope, because Kim's life is all about giving hope to others, because she is a miracle, and each one of you listening is a miracle. And if you come from a background of sexual abuse, if you come from a background that made you feel like you're worthless or shouldn't even be here or are not worthy of love, know that all of that is a lie. None of that is the truth. And Jesus came to set you free with the truth that sets everything free. All the lies to be scattered, because in essence, they have no power unless we give them power. So in the name of Jesus Christ, please, audience, pray with me. Say to yourself, in the name of Jesus, I break and I send away any lies that have plagued me throughout my life. I send them back to hell where they came from. And Lord Jesus, please bring me your spirit of truth. Bring me your love. Help me to feel it and to know it deep in my soul, deep in my bones. And may those lies about myself never return. For I am a daughter, I am a son of the King. God bless you. You've been listening to Find Something More, Find Your Way Home on Radio Maria. We look forward to joining you in Kim's part 2 next week. God bless.
God bless.
Good job.
I was so lost in the beginning. Like, I was like, oh my gosh. And you like right on time, because I was like, because usually I've told my story so many, I was never that like, okay, who am I? What did I do? No, I was just like, and I gave a lot of, and then I was like, and I missed some salient points, and I just was like,
oh no,
it was okay. Like, I just felt like I was too long in the beginning, and there was it's actually kind of, it's amazing what happens. Like, what happens, like, changed my life forever. Like, really, it's just, that's when, my most amazing experience with Jesus. So yeah, that was kind of cool. Like, the Radio Maria guy was like, hey, where'd you get that picture of Jesus? Like, because that's from the monastery, the Benedictine monastery. Yeah, so it was like, it was just cool that
that's so cool.
It was funny because I was like, Michael's like, are you nervous? And I go, yeah. I go, I'd rather speak in front of 500 people right now than do this.
Wow.